all roads lead to Rome. The fact that the Vatican is a church makes you wonder why it needs to be its own country, because Vatican City is essentially the smallest country on earth.
Mussolini had enormous power, but knew he still had to appease the 99% of Italians who were Catholics. And the Vatican also wanted a deal.
As a result of the Risorgimento, Italian unification in the 19th century, the church lost its status, and it lost its property. It lost its the papal states vanished. So from 1870 until 1929, the Pope really had no country.
In 1929, Mussolini and the Vatican signed the Lateran Pacts, giving the Church virtually everything it wanted. The Pope gained control of the Vatican City as a sovereign state and received 1.75 billion lira in compensation for historic losses, mostly in government bonds.
And the government bonds obviously meant that in some curious way, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, was underwriting the fascist state. And people at the time warned this was a very dangerous thing to be doing. The Vatican had committed itself to fascism for the foreseeable future. It had no confidence in the capacity of democracy to protect Italy against communism.
Pope Pius XI proclaimed that Mussolini was that man whom divine providence had allowed him to meet. He soon proved him very wrong. In 1935, fascist forces invaded Ethiopia, Africa's last independent nation. Ciano was among the 600,000-strong Italian invasion force. He took part in bombing raids on civilians and proudly boasted, "We have carried out a slaughter."
The way that Mussolini dealt with the Ethiopian question, I think, shows just how calculated and ruthless the man really was.
The Ethiopians fought back desperately.
So then the order was issued by Mussolini in December 1935 to make widespread use of chemical weapons, mustard gas and phosgene, and to use terror tactics en masse.
The Italians even deliberately bombed 19 Red Cross hospitals. Over 250,000 Ethiopians were killed in the fighting.
Molto tempo si è cercato di nascondere.
There are many different theories as to why the Pope was silent about Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. And, you know, some of those reasons are that he didn't want the Italian people to feel betrayed by siding with the League of Nations. He didn't like that Russia was heavily influencing the League of Nations. He didn't want Austria to become pro-Nazi.
Ethiopia wasn't just about the Italians conquering Ethiopia, it was about them taking on the international order. Is about challenging the predominant Mediterranean powers, the British and the French, for eventual control. That battle, that route to global war, started really in Europe with the Ethiopian crisis of 1935.
Mussolini's aggressive foreign policy was hugely popular at home, but poisoned relations with Britain and France. Mussolini knew that in contrast to Britain and France, he had Hitler's backing in Ethiopia.
And because Austria was at risk of being pro-Nazi, you know, some assert that the Pope thought Mussolini was the only one who could prevent that from happening, which is why he tried to essentially appease Mussolini's conquest in Ethiopia. There were other theories that the Pope and the Vatican assumed that the only alternatives to fascism at the time were Bolshevism and anti-clerical governments. So there's many different theories as to why the Pope was silent, but I will demonstrate the main reason why the Vatican was not only complicit, but was actually behind
Since the early
invasion.
1930s, Italian instructors had trained the Dubat fiercest of the Somali tribesmen, to fight a war with modern European weapons and traditional Somali ferocity. Graziani ordered them to advance across the disputed border region into the parched desert of Ogaden. General Graziani was a ruthless colonial campaigner, eager for his chance of glory and jealous of General De Bono, who commanded the more important northern front.
Some historians have written that the Pope didn't actually feel the need to protect Ethiopia because of its archaic backwardness and
Graziani moved men and supplies forward across the river Webe Shebele, destroying Ethiopian resistance as he pushed north.
the fact that
He urged Mussolini to authorize a march on Harar.
Slavery and anarchy kind of ruled in the outskirts of the nation, but I'm going to demonstrate that the Pope's silence was far more sinister in nature. I'm going to show some sources also that gives the true intention of the Roman Catholic Church during the war. And also, I'm going to demonstrate that the Pope and the Vatican wanted to assassinate Emperor Haile Selassie. I'm going to show some sources in support of that. And it should also be recognized that after the fall of Fascist Italy, the attempts on Emperor Haile Selassie's life essentially stopped because Mussolini was the military arm of the church. So that's also not a coincidence that can be overlooked.
Avanti! Avanti!
In this documentary, you're about to see one of the Roman Catholic chaplains blessing not only the men, but also the quote-unquote medal.
Only one Italian division had been sent to the southern front. In the north, Graziani's rival, General De Bono, had 10. Graziani was therefore forced into a largely defensive role, protecting the long border positions in the disputed Ogaden against the threat of counter-invasion by the armies of Ras Desta and Ras Nasibu. But Graziani was not content with defense. He had sworn that the Duce shall have Ethiopia with or without the Ethiopians.
Caricate, puntate! Attenzione che stanno vedendo!
Of course, it's also true that Mussolini wanted to avenge the loss at the Battle of Ottawa, 1896, which also fed into it. But the main perpetrators behind this war are essentially the Pope and the Vatican, and they had the most to gain by subjecting the Ethiopians to the Pontiff. So motivation-wise, they had the motive, essentially.
Mussolini was impatient with De Bono's cautious advance in the north. He insisted on action, and his commander reluctantly ordered the Blackshirts to begin the prestigious march on the undefended town of Makale.
Hosanna in excelsis, benedictus qui venit in nomine Domini, Hosanna in excelsis.
Men and metal received the chaplain's blessing, and the fascist crusade took its civilizing mission south.
Sanctus, Sanctus, Sanctus Dominus Deus, in nomine Patris, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Amen.
This is one of the better scenes in this documentary. You're about to see
The the Regia
Emperor
Aeronautica
actually
ruled the skies unchallenged. Reconnaissance aircraft patrolled all day, mapping the land and looking for the white cotton shamas which betrayed the enemy. Bombers terrorized towns, villages, and marching columns with almost complete impunity. Italy's air power decided the war.
In this next scene, you're going to see the Emperor actually sitting behind an anti-aircraft
Anti-aircraft guns
machine
in
gun.
Ethiopia was the Emperor's Earlycon, mounted on a rock terrace outside a bomb-proof cave in the hills near Dessie. The cave had become his headquarters after constant bomb attacks had driven him from the town.
So Haile Selassie is going to be sitting at this anti-aircraft machine gun, and you're going to see one of the Italian fascist airplanes get knocked out of the sky with a nice little smile from His Majesty. You see Haile Selassie aiming at this airplane. Let's take a look at the motivations and the reasons behind the war. A book called The Papacy and Politics Today by Joseph McCabe, Vatican Plots and Intrigues in Every Country. So in Chapter 4, The Pope and the Italian Fascists, we have so far consented under cajolery or threats to remove from our literature, journalism, and schools whatever is offensive to Catholics, that few now know how the history of many countries, even in the last century, is sodden with blood and tears owing to this ruthless will to power of the papacy. The Catholic layman, indeed, is so pathetically ignorant of it, since he is forbidden to read any writer who tells the facts, that he ingenuously wonders why men hate the church so much, and he is ready to accept the infantile explanation of his priest that it is so holy that the devil rages against it with peculiar frenzy. He must not read even the Catholic writer who has the culture and courage to ascertain the facts. The Catholic historian Lord Acton, writing to the Catholic historian Lady Blennerhassett, said, "The accomplices of the old man of the mountain, the most famous assassins in history, picked off individual victims, but the papacy contrived murder and massacre on the largest and also on the most cruel and inhuman scale. They were not only wholesale assassins, but they also made the principle of assassination a law of the Christian church and a condition of salvation." So the rise and character of fascism. Benito Mussolini was a particularly violent, indeed quite scurrilous atheist and Republican until 1921. In 1922, he was shaking the hand of the king in Rome, presenting a valuable old library to the Pope and urging his followers to see that the presence in their capital, the papacy, gave Rome a valuable international prestige. Today he attends pious functions and gives pearl rosary beads as presents to his daughters, and he shares with the Pope the distinction of having deprived Italy of those rights of free discussion and independent personality for which since 1799 the country had sacrificed the lives of nearly 250,000 of its finest sons and daughters, of having debauched with war propaganda the minds of millions of Italians, and of having the chief share in bringing degradation and the threat of ruin upon Europe. So the Unholy Alliance, Section 3, reads, "Many readers will remember the unctuous language in which most of our papers greeted the signing of the agreement on February 11th, 1929. The long rift in the spiritual life of Italy had ended, and church and state were to work henceforth in fruitful cooperation. That the Pope had accepted 19 million lire in cash. I have heard that he invested the 8 million lire in cash in America and lost it in the crash. And bonds, 5% state bonds, was regarded as entirely proper. It was just the accumulated annual payment which the government had assigned him, and every Pope had since refused. In 1870, no writer recalls held that, as all historians admit, the papacy had got its states by the most blatant of medieval forgeries, the donation of Constantine, etc., or the fact that the inhabitants had repudiated the Pope's rule by 30-1. None reflected on the character and apostasies of the quaintest ally that the papacy had had since the 17th century. None pointed out that the Duce had sold not only his own convictions, but also the freedom of conscience of more than 10 million Italians, who were now to be sent to jail for from 5 to 10 years if they criticized the Holy Church, and who must hand over all their children to the priests. It was, in fact, one of the most tainted bargains of modern times, and a fit inauguration of a decade of increasing corruption. By the treaty which was first signed, the Pope got his 19 million lire and 108 acres of Rome to convert into a free principality, the Vatican City. By the Concordat, which followed, he got control of the entire educational system of Italy, except the universities, and at once instituted compulsory religious teachings. He got Catholicism established as the religion of the state, a large annual contribution to the clergy, a complete service of paid chaplains in the army, and all public institutions, the recognition of the bodies of monks and nuns as juridical personalities with an indefinite power to accumulate property, the enforcement of religious marriage, truculent penalties upon all criticism of the Catholic religion in print or orally, substantial relief from taxation for the clergy and ecclesiastical property, the recognition of the Church's holy days as legal holidays, and, in a particularly venomous clause, the expulsion of ex-priests, of whom there were hundreds, from teaching in all branches of the civil service. This did not satisfy the Pope. He wanted the whole canon law, as I described it, incorporated in civil law, the suppression of any other than the Roman religion, the full control of marriage by the Church, the control of the universities, and so on. Mussolini's followers refused to tolerate this, and he had to assure them that he would check the Pope's zeal in exploiting some of his concessions, as he in fact did. The son of an atheist working man had sold, for the security of his princely position, the freedom for which his country had fought and sacrificed for 130 years, and he attempted to save his face by deriding liberty and the Mazzinis and Garibaldis who had led the struggle for it. What had the Pope sold? The last shred of a title to be considered a moral power or moral guide. He had seen Mussolini and his black shirts, after 2 or 3 years of bloody and vulgar brawling, enter into an alliance with the army. 4 generals walked in the march upon Rome and destroy the constitution of his country. He had since seen a penal code of a quite savage severity used for the silencing of Mussolini's critics. He had seen tens of thousands sent to jail or exile and hundreds murdered. He knew, as he soon afterwards confessed, that Mussolini was still a heretic and was just using religion to protect his usurped power. Above all, he knew, as we shall see, that Mussolini was openly organizing the nation for aggressive war and pouring the dregs of his picturesque but vulgar oratory upon the ideal of peace for which the Church professed to have the most profound regard. Yet through all the outrages, even the appalling rape of Abyssinia, he has, with the money bag under his arm, supported the adventurer. The treaty and Concordat were signed on February 11th. On May 13th, Mussolini, faced with the revolt of his followers, made in the chamber a speech which sent the Vatican City into convulsions. He had, quote, made no concessions. He had not Vaticanized Italy. He had not resuscitated the Pope's temporal power, but had buried it. He would see that the Church did not control marriage and would not compel non-Catholic children to have religious instruction. In this field, he cried, we are intransigent. Education must be ours. He would keep the clergy in order, guarantee freedom of conscience, and see that the city of Rome should not be closed to the currents of new ideas and to the acquisition of modern thought. I translate these sentences from the published speech. He made several speeches on the same note, and on May 30th, the Pope was stung into replying. He published in the Osservatore Romano, the Papal and Jesuit organ, a long letter to his Secretary of State, Cardinal Gaspari. It has never been translated, for it shows the Pope in the year 1929 fierily insisting upon claims which Catholic apologists in England and America were representing as a bandit. I have translated much of the letter or essays from the Osservatore, and will here give a few short passages. They are painful reading to those non-Catholics who are deluded by English apologists for the Church. We need not mind that Mussolini's words were denounced as heretical and worse than heretical. Some of them literally were. The Pope knew well all the time that he was dealing with an apostate. He angrily rejected the statement that no concessions had been made to the Church and that the state would still control the clergy. The Church was absolutely superior to the state. Mussolini had said that other religions would be tolerated. The Pope prefers the word permitted, but detests both. And he insists that the logical and juridical consequences of the establishment of the Church shall be carried out, especially in the matter of propaganda. In other words, there shall be no freedom of expression. In matters of conscience, and the Pope is to decide which are, the Church alone has competent authority, and therefore in a Catholic state, liberty of conscience and of discussion must be understood and carried out in accordance with the Catholic teaching and law. In other words, as we saw in the 3rd chapter, they must be suppressed. He makes this clear when he goes on to claim that under the Concordat, any discussion of religion, written or oral, which might, quote, easily mislead the good faith of the less enlightened must be punished by law. As to education, Mussolini had recently repeated in a speech his familiar cry that Italy was to breed and train a race of conquerors. The Church would absolutely control it. The full and perfect right to educate does not belong to the state, but to the Church, and the state cannot impede or restrict it in the exercise and fulfillment of its right, or confine it to the subsidized teaching of religious truth. In fine, if Mussolini did not behave himself, the Pope would repudiate the treaty and bring about the fall of the state, which is dependent upon Vatican City for its being. It is a useful admission or boast of the Pope's share. In the latter part of 1931, Mussolini became alarmed. His regime was a failure economically, and all classes were suffering privations. The number of university students fell by 10,000, so he made an unstable peace. Catholic associations for the young were permitted, and the fascist oath now for the first time included the word God. Criticism of the church was violently suppressed, and in February 1932, the leading fascists shuddered to see Mussolini kneeling before the altar in St. Peter's and being blessed by the Pope, in spite of the most persistent use of the power of the fascists, whose reward is lucrative service in the administration and the army. The fascist party grew but slowly. At the end of 1934, it still counted less than 3 million adult and child members. If, as we ought, we decline to count teachers who are all bound by an oath of loyalty to Mussolini, civil servants, and the members of recreational and athletic associations. Yet since the Duce was preparing the nation for war, he must have some sort of unity, and the Pope's 70,000 priests were, as Napoleon had found, a useful spiritual gendarmerie. Section 4, the rape of Abyssinia, states, from the first, the Duce proclaimed a gospel of force, violence, and war of conquest, and from the start the Pope knew this. His 70,000 priests worked in the schools in cooperation with teachers who were debauching the minds of the children with the glorification of the sword of conquest, of callousness to bloodshed. He himself sent pretty messages to England and America about the Prince of Peace, and he silently looked upon the corruption of the Italian people and the preparation of Europe for a conflict of aggressive greeds and ambitions in which all idealism would be trampled into the mud. So he was dragged into sharing responsibility for one of the gravest outrages of our time, the rape of Abyssinia. I am not in this work relying upon suspicions of the kind of intrigue and secret agreements which can never be satisfactorily proved. Therefore, I say nothing about the statement that Mussolini held out the inducement of bringing the whole Abyssinian church into subjection to the Pope, though a man must be strangely unacquainted with the policy of the Vatican to imagine that it was indifferent to this. The known facts suffice. The Pope and the Italian hierarchy supported what Mussolini has quite clownishly called the most glorious victory in history. Cardinal Schuster, the national head of the Italian Church, enthusiastically hailed the war in Abyssinia as a holy war, a righteous war. Bishops and priests everywhere supported it. Italy was flooded with picture postcards, some of which showed the magnificent resources of gold, oil, wheat, etc., which they were acquiring, while others showed Mussolini's tanks bearing statues of the Virgin and the saints of the benighted Ethiopians. Does anybody imagine that the whole Italian Church, with Cardinal Schuster at its head, enthusiastically cooperated with the fascist authorities against the will of the Pope? Yet our press and literature are already admitting the myth that the Pope at least maintained a dignified and rebuking silence. Catholic apologists who on one page tell their readers how popes never compromise or restrain their moral indignation ask us here to regard silence as courage. But he was not silent. The Pope had, as a matter of fact, already spoken and had plainly enough defended the rape of Abyssinia. But his words caused such painful astonishment amongst the Catholics of England, France, and the United States that he turned to the policy of silence and let the Italian prelates, whose activity was not reported abroad, carry out his share of his sinister compact with Mussolini. His first pronouncements were Delphic. On July 28th, he had to give a eulogy of an Italian prelate who had worked in Abyssinia, and he briefly said, though the war was now quite inevitable, that he still hoped for peace and was quite sure that nothing will happen except in accordance with truth, justice, and charity. On August 28th, when the war was definitely in train, he addressed a body of Catholic nurses. There was talk abroad, he said, of a war of conquest, which would be unjust. But in Italy, men said that it was a defensive war against Ethiopian aggression and to acquire territory for the overcrowded population of Italy. If these pleas were sound, he still hoped, while the troops were on the sea in their tens of thousands, that some way, I do not know what way, he said, would be found other than war to secure Italy's interests. Some papers read this one way and some another, and the Pope had a note put in the Osservatore, August 20th, saying that to take territory from others to provide for your surplus population was not by itself a ground for war, but that defense can very well by itself alone be justified, though it must not become an excess of defense. The August lips then closed, and the Catholic press abroad was able to claim that the Pope had never agreed, but the Italian Catholics read his words in the way he knew they would. The Duce said that it was a defensive war, and the Pope said defense was just. The whole church enthusiastically supported it. Foxy to the end, the world's great moral oracle had the bells of St. Peter's rung to call the people to the piazza for the final announcement of victory on October 1st, but St. Peter's was not illuminated, and every other church was. And the entire Italian hierarchy ordered prayers for God's blessing on Italy's rulers and her glorious army, which once more is used in defense of the Christian civilization. We seem to remember the Italian army taking the papal states for the Pope, but not that the Italians ever took part even in the Crusades. The Pope now offers to bless the enterprise and convert it, like Hitler's plan to conquer Russia and Japan's plan to conquer China, like Italy's conquest of Abyssinia, into a highly respectable campaign to protect the interests of religion. So how is he protecting the interest of religion with the conquest of Abyssinia? And to understand how and why this is happening, you have to be a little bit familiar with Roman Catholicism. So here are some quotes about the Pope and the Catholics' assertion of his divinity on earth. Quote, to believe that our Lord God the Pope has not the power to decree as he has decreed is to be deemed heretical. Those whom the Pope of Rome doth separate it is not a man that separates them, but God. For the Pope holdeth place on earth, not simply of a man, but of the true God, dissolves not by human, but rather by divine authority. I am in all and above all, so that God himself and I, the vicar of God, hath both one consistory, and I am able to do almost all that God can do. Wherefore, if those things that I do be said not to be done of man, but of God, what do you make of me but God? Again, if prelates of the church be called of Constantine for gods, I then, being above all prelates, seem by this reason to be above all gods. The Pope takes the place of Jesus Christ on earth. By divine right, the Pope has supreme and full power in faith and morals over each and every pastor in his flock. He is the true vicar, the head of the entire church, the father and teacher of all Christians. He is the infallible ruler, the founder of dogmas, the author and the judge of councils, the universal ruler of truth, the arbiter of the world, the supreme judge of heaven and earth, the judge of all, being judged by no one, God himself on earth. The Pope alone is called most holy. Hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown as King of heaven and of earth and of hell. Moreover, the superiority and the power of the Roman Pontiff by no means pertains only to heavenly things, but also to earthly things, and to things under the earth, and even over the angels whom he is greater than. Moreover, the superiority and the power of the Roman Pontiff by no means pertains only to heavenly things, but also earthly things. So that if it were possible that the angels might err in the faith, or might think contrary to the faith, they could be judged and excommunicated by the Pope. So that if it were possible that the angels might err in faith, the Pope alone is called most holy. Hence the Pope is crowned with a triple crown, as King of heaven and earth and of hell. Moreover, the superiority and the power of the Roman Pontiff by no means pertains only to heavenly things, but also earthly things, and to things under the earth, and even over angels, whom he is greater than. So that if it were possible that the angels might err in the faith, or might think contrary to the faith, they could be judged and excommunicated by the Pope. The Pope, as it were, God on earth, sole sovereign of the faithful of Christ, chief of kings, having plenitude of power. The Pope and God are the same, so he has all power in heaven and earth. We hold upon this earth the place of Almighty God. That's a quote by Pope Leo XIII. The Pope's authority is unlimited, incalculable. It can strike, as Innocent III says, wherever sin is. It can punish everyone. It allows no appeal and is itself sovereign caprice. For the Pope carries, according to the expression of Boniface VIII, all rights in the shrine of his breast. As he has now become infallible, he can, by the use of the little word orbi, which means that he turns himself round to the whole church, make every rule, every doctrine, every demand into a certain and uncontestable article of faith. No right can stand against him, no personal or corporate liberty, or as the canonists put it, the tribunal of God and of the Pope is one and the same. Therefore, the decision of the Pope and the decision of God constitute one decision. Since therefore an appeal is always made from an inferior judge to a superior, just as no one is greater than himself, so no appeal holds when made from the Pope to God, because there is one consistory of the Pope himself and of God himself. We confess that the Pope has power of changing Scripture and of adding to it and taking from it according to his will. We confess that whatever new thing the Pope ordains, whether it be in the Scriptures or not in the Scriptures, and whatever he commands is true, divine, and salvific, and therefore ought to be held by lay people in greater esteem than the living God. It is absolutely necessary that the Christian community be subjected in all things to the sovereign pontiff, if it wishes to be a part of the divinely established society founded by our Redeemer. It is an error to believe that a man is in the church if he abandons the see of Peter, the foundation of the church. The Savior himself is the door of the sheepfold. I am the door of the sheep. Into this fold of Jesus Christ no man may enter unless he be led by the sovereign pontiff, and only if they be united to him can men be saved. For the Roman pontiff is the vicar of Christ and his personal representative on earth. It's a quote by Pope John the 23rd. To be subject to the Roman pontiff is absolutely necessary for salvation. St. Thomas Aquinas. Whether it be possible for him, the Pope, to err or not, is to be obeyed by all the faithful. It is error to believe that if the Pope were reprobate and an evil man, and consequently a member of the devil, he has no power over the faithful. Even if the Pope were Satan incarnate, we ought not to raise up our heads against him, but calmly lie down to rest on his bosom. He who rebels against our Father is condemned to death. For that which we do to him, we do to Christ. We honor Christ if we honor the Pope. We dishonor Christ if we dishonor the Pope. I know very well that many defend themselves by boasting. They are so corrupt and work all manner of evil. But God has commanded that even if the priests, the pastors, and Christ on earth were incarnate devils, we be obedient and subject to them, not for their sakes, but for the sake of God, and out of obedience to him. It is error to believe that if the Pope were wicked and reprobate, then he is of the devil and is not the head of the church militant. The Pope is the supreme judge of the law of the land. He is the vice-regent of Christ and is not only a priest forever, but also King of kings and Lord of lords. All the names which are attributed to Christ in Scripture, implying his supremacy over the church, are also attributed to the Pope. The Pope is not only the representative of Jesus Christ, he is Jesus Christ himself hidden under the veil of flesh. The appellation of God had been confirmed by Constantine on the Pope, who being God cannot be judged by man. That's Pope Nicholas I. So if the Pope is God on earth, and according to the Catholics, he is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, and the Vatican sent Mussolini to invade Ethiopia because it considered it to be a defensive holy war. The reason why this happened is because Emperor Haile Selassie was in fact the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the true and living God. The Pope, by reason of the excellence of his supreme dignity, is called Bishop of Bishops. He is also called Ordinary of Ordinaries. He is likewise Bishop of the Universal Church. He is likewise the Divine Monarch and Supreme Emperor and King of Kings. Hence, the Pope is crowned with a triple crown as King of Heaven and of Earth and of the lower regions. Moreover, the superiority and the power of the Roman Pontiff by no means pertain only to the heavenly things, to the earthly things, and to the things under the earth, but are even over angels, than whom he is greater. So that if it were possible that the angels might err in faith, or might think contrary to the faith, they could be judged and excommunicated by the Pope. For he is of so great dignity and power that he forms one and the same tribunal with Christ, so that whatever the Pope does seems to proceed from the mouth of God, as according to most doctors, etc. We define that the Holy Apostolic See, the Vatican, and the Roman Pontiff hold the primacy over the whole world. So the reason the Vatican attacked Ethiopia is because Haile Selassie's legitimate acquisition of both titles, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, directly challenged the spiritual authority of the Vatican. If we look at this article written by Asafa Jalata, Being in and Out of Africa, the Impact of Duality of Ethiopianism, we'll see that in 1931, Haile Selassie officially changed the name Abyssinia to Ethiopia in his constitution. So, God is a mind that transcends space, matter, time, and energy. That mind was localized in the person of Emperor Haile Selassie on July 23rd, 1892. On February the 11th, 1917, His Majesty became Leul Ras. He was crowned with the title Leul Ras, February 11, 1917. His Excellency Gregory Copley, in his book that he co-authored with His Imperial Highness Prince Eremias Haile Selassie, states that a Leul Ras was the equivalent to a royal duke, and we know that the highest appellation of a duke is a lord. Therefore, Haile Selassie was crowned Lord of Lords, February 11, 1917. Leul Ras means Lord of Lords. On November the 2nd, 1930, Haile Selassie was crowned with the title Negusa Nagast, Emperor of Ethiopia, literally King of Kings. Therefore, Haile Selassie is the only person in attested history in the Common Era to legitimately acquire both titles, King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and to hold both of those offices simultaneously. And then, a year later, in 1931, when he made the first constitution of Ethiopia, he officially changed the name Abyssinia to Ethiopia. So this now fulfills the prophecy of the scriptures that states that God will be born in modern-day Ethiopia and will rule the nation for about 40 years with both titles, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Haile Selassie fulfilled the prophecy of the scriptures pertaining to God's manifestation on earth. That is how he is a direct threat to papal supremacy, and that is how the Vatican viewed him as a threat to their spiritual authority, which is why they considered Mussolini's war in Ethiopia to be a defensive holy war. There are more sources to support this. In a book, Terror Over Yugoslavia, The Threat to Europe by Avro Manhattan, this book even details how Mussolini had King Alexander of Yugoslavia assassinated. Hitler supported Mussolini in his seizure of Abyssinia. And then it says, to further its inroads, Catholicism does not always come forward openly championing its own cause. Very often, as in so many instances in the past, it cunningly identifies itself with those who hosanna for freedom, the better to persuade them to fight with it against the foes of liberty, quote-unquote. Western history is a witness to this. Following Constantine's edict, papal Christianity unloosed such terror that in no time it stamped out the surviving creeds of the Greco-Roman world. In the Dark and Middle Ages, whoever dared to think independently of Catholicism was mercilessly silenced by Catholic sword and fire. Following the birth of Protestantism, the Catholic Church, in its attempt to annihilate it, plunged Europe into a sea of blood. Catholic absolutism, owing to its ability to attack any man, culture, or civilization anywhere and at any time, if permitted to grow, will repeat all the horrors of the past. Catholicism and totalitarianism being indivisible. Like Siamese twins, the two cannot be separated. Catholicism, therefore, will automatically attack whatever is not Catholic. During the last few decades, the Orthodox Church was selected as the chief target of a Catholic war, which is far from having ended. In this book, Ethiopia Under Mussolini, Fascism and the Colonial Experience by Alberto Spacci, both Graziani and the Duke of Aosta felt the pressure exercised upon the affairs of Ethiopia by the Ministry of Africa. The smallest decision had to be made by Rome. When the Italian generals reported to Rome that Addis Ababa was surrounded by large enemy forces, they were told to treat any surviving Ethiopian troops as rebels, and hence all prisoners were to be shot without trial. Mussolini ordered that brute force should be preferred to magnanimity. His instructions were not only to execute prisoners, but to continue using poison gas and a systemic policy of terror and extermination. One of Mussolini's most infamous decisions was to kill off young Ethiopian intellectuals on the assumption that without them the country would be more easily governed. Some prominent citizens surrendered on the promise of a pardon, only to be shot out of hand. The worst excesses occurred in February 1937 after an attempt on Graziani's life. The would-be assassins were two Eritreans in the employ of the Italian political office in Addis Ababa. In the book My Journey with the United Nations in Quest for the Horn of Africa's Unity and Justice for Ethiopia by Kidane Alamayehu, to this day, the war crime remains unattended. Not one Italian has been brought to a tribunal to answer for the war crimes committed against Ethiopia. It is truly amazing to note that the United Nations has not even placed the war crime in its records. It is as if all that devastating war crime never happened. 1 million Ethiopians killed, of whom 30,000 were massacred in only 3 days in Addis Ababa in 1937. Huge quantities of Ethiopian properties were looted by the Italians. Some of these properties are currently still in the possession of the Vatican and the Italian governments. 2,000 churches, 525,000 homes, as well as 14 million animals were destroyed as a result of the bombing fire and the use of mustard gas and poison gas. The use of the internationally forbidden poison gas also had a devastating effect on the environment. Provisional estimates of the slaughter of Ethiopians compiled by the Ethiopian government in 1946 from the evidence thus far investigated, and there are, in addition, a large number of persons rendered permanent invalids, including victims of poison gas. 275,000 killed in action, 78,500 patriots killed in the battle during 5 years of fascist occupation. Children, women, old, and infirm people killed by bombing during the occupation, 17,800. Massacre of February 1937, 30,000. Patriots condemned to death by Count Marshall, 24,000. Persons of both sexes who died in concentration camps from privation and maltreatment, 35,000. People who died of privations owing to destruction of their villages during the 5 years of occupation, 300,000. Provisional estimates of casualties, 760,000. The picture of many thousands of soldiers as well as rural people, including women and children, who were burned to death by the poison gas used by the enemy in fascist Italy is still etched in our minds. The genocide that was inflicted on the people of Ethiopia was not limited to the use of bombs, bullets, and poison gas. The Italian fascists used every weapon they could think of to wage their horrendous crimes against Ethiopia, including hanging, burning people up in their own homes, chopping heads off, and amazingly throwing people off airplanes. For example, Abuna Mikael, one of the bishops of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, was killed by being thrown off from a fascist airplane. Abuna Petros, thousands others from the EOTC were simply shot by the fascists. Looting the Ethiopian properties, the following sources are presented merely as examples. Badoglio, the first viceroy of Ethiopia, requested to be given all the money in the Bank of Ethiopia in Addis Ababa. The amount found in the Bank of Ethiopia was $1,700,000 Maria Theresa dollars, half of which went to Badoglio. With this money, he built himself a villa in Rome and furnished it with 300 cases of war booty and gifts flown from Ethiopia by the Air Force. Graziani, who took over as viceroy from Badoglio as of June 1st, 1936, had a luggage of 79 suitcases when he returned to Italy. Ian Campbell provides evidence of fascist Italian lootings from certain Ethiopian churches and monasteries, especially the renowned Debre Libanos monastery, including the following: a very large prayer book given by Emperor Gelawdewos, a very large Ge'ez manuscript decorated with gold, a gold-bound Bible, innumerable prayer books, many illustrated religious manuscripts, large drums decorated with gold, crowns of emperors Johannes IV, Melik II, and Haile Selassie I, ecclesiastical ornaments of high quality, golden crosses, 12 gold embroidered gowns, including one given by Emperor Fasilidas, 4,000 Maria Theresa dollars. The fascist atrocities inflicted on Ethiopian patriots were unimaginable. The brutal measures taken by the fascists, an important patriot known as Albareta, had been encircled by the enemy force, but had managed to keep it off by fighting for 8 days. In this fight, they killed numerous bandas, African soldiers of the fascist army, and Italians, but surrendered as they were unable to escape, as well as the fact that their bullets were finished. The Italians chopped off the heads of about 13 patriots and showed them off at Debre Berhan town. The renowned patriot Albareta, his 12-year-old son, was also captured. He was also firing along with his father. When they wanted to pardon him in view of his youthful age, he responded with courage: "I do not want you to spare me when my father sacrificed his life for the love of this country." The Italians, who were enraged by this statement, shot and killed him, as well as chopping off his head. Finally, in 1941, the Italian invasion came to its dismal end, and Ethiopia continued as an independent nation. Thus, the Italians were defeated by the Ethiopians for the second time in its attempted colonization of Ethiopia, the first one being the War of Ottawa in 1896. Emperor Haile Selassie I returned to power, and one of the important measures taken by the Ethiopian government, for which he deserved the highest compliments, was to forbid any reprisals against the remaining fascist Italians and their supporters. With few exceptions, the fascist Italians and their Ethiopian supporters, bandas, were not subject to any attack. It is important to note that none of the fascist war criminals were brought to justice in an international tribunal similar to the Nazis. Therefore, the major fascist leaders such as Badoglio and Graziani escaped justice for their huge war crimes in Ethiopia. That does not, however, mean that they and the other fascist criminals post-mortem or the living are free from prosecution, as there is no statute of limitations for such war crimes. The related sad situation that has recently occurred is the installation of a mausoleum for the butcher of Ethiopia, the fascist criminal Rodolfo Graziani, at a small town southeast of Rome called Affile on August 11, 2012, with some funding by the Italian government. Objections to this inappropriate action have been expressed through public demonstrations and written appeals by various anti-fascist groups, as well as the activist entity Global Alliance for Justice, the Ethiopian Cause, www.globalallianceforethiopia.net. That should read .net. .org is the old website, apparently. Mausoleum for the fascist butcher of Ethiopia, Rodolfo Graziani, being inaugurated at Affile, Italy, in the presence of Italian officials and a representative of the Vatican. For a full report on the event, a reference to BBC news item of August 15th would be useful. In terms of the fascist war crimes, which resulted in 1 million Ethiopian victims and other devastations, Italy managed to pay a minuscule amount of US $25 million, whereas it agreed to pay $125 million to Yugoslavia, $105 million to Greece, and $100 million to the Soviet Union, as well as recently $5 billion to Libya. The only restitution that has occurred so far is Italy's return of the Axum obelisk to Ethiopia. The properties looted by the fascists and currently in the possession of Italy and the Vatican have yet to be returned to the Ethiopian people. These include an airplane known as Sahay, looted from Ethiopia, being shown at the Italian Air Force Museum, and the over 500 manuscripts found at the Vatican Library. It is obvious that the blood of the Ethiopian martyrs is still crying for justice from the international community, including the United Nations, Italy, and the Vatican. The Vatican's complicity with the fascists is always a source of wonder how it was possible for the most populous Christian entity, that is, the Catholic Church, could form a partnership with a highly criminal political organization, the Fascist Party, applying an inhuman political system in Italy as well as the nation it had invaded, namely Ethiopia and its colonial empire, that is, Libya, Eritrea, and Somalia. The Vatican was definitely complicit with Mussolini and his fascist party. The Vatican's complicity with the fascists commenced in 1922 when Pope Pius XI and Mussolini started moves towards laying down the concrete steps for collaboration in a mutually beneficial manner. There are numerous sources of evidence proving, beyond any reasonable doubt, as to Pope Pius XI's and the Vatican's complicity with the fascists. The following are provided as examples. Avro Manhattan, the Vatican World Politics. Cardinal Roddy was elected Pope Pius XI in 1922. After his coronation, Pope Pius XI, who had no love for democracy, steered the political helm unhesitatingly towards the new fascist party, making overtures by rendering it a great service. On October 2nd, 1922, the Vatican issued a circular letter bidding the clergy not to identify themselves with the Catholic Party, thereby paving the way for a national recognition of fascism. Following the dissolution of its own Catholic Party, the Vatican, under the leadership of Pope Pius XI, joined hands with Mussolini's fascist party in finally getting rid of the socialist and liberal parties in Italy. By 1926, the fascist government became what it had wanted to be, the first fascist totalitarian dictatorship. The negotiations, which significantly enough were started with the dissolution of the Catholic Party in 1926, were concluded in 1929 with the signing of what has since been known as the Lateran Agreement, by which the Vatican was recognized as an independent sovereign state and the fascist government undertook to pay a vast sum of money as compensation. The agreement was acclaimed by the Catholic Church and Catholics throughout the world, and the prestige of fascism was greatly enhanced. The Lateran Agreement therefore provided the foundation for the close collaboration between Pope Pius XI and Mussolini, paving the way for the fascist dictatorship in Italy, as well as its unbridled subsequent international adventures, including its invasion of Ethiopia. Mussolini's response was to arrange the payment of 1.5 billion lire to the Bank of Rome, which was on the brink of bankruptcy at the time. The Bank of Rome was under the control of the Catholics, and the funds of the Vatican's high prelates and the Holy See itself were entrusted to it. It was the alliance of these two men, Pius XI and Mussolini, that influenced so greatly the social and political pattern, not only of Italy, but also of the rest of Europe in the years between the two world wars. Once the Lateran Agreement was signed and the Vatican achieved its financial and political objectives with the fascists, it vigorously undertook its share of promoting the fascists within Italy as well as internationally. Cardinal Vanutelli, head of the Sacred College of Cardinals, paid a public homage to Mussolini by stating the Duce Mussolini had been chosen by God to save the nation and to restore her fortune. On February 13, 1929, Pope Pius XI proclaimed to the world that Mussolini was the man whom divine providence had allowed him to meet. All priests were ordered to pray daily for the king and the Duce. Children had to say grace before each meal. A typical example: Duce, I thank you for what you have given me to make me grow healthy and strong. O Lord God, protect the Duce so that he may be long preserved for fascist Italy. Thus the church became the religious weapon of the fascist state, while the fascist state became the secular arm of the church. The Vatican had at last gathered the fruits of its new policy: annihilation of its great enemies, secularism, liberalism, Freemasonry, socialism, communism, democracy, and restoration of the Catholic Church as the predominant spiritual power in the land. Mussolini had a plan for the success for which the help of the Catholic Church was needed. And in 1935, the first series of successive fascist aggressions, which finally led to the outbreak of the Second World War, was ruthlessly carried out. Fascist Italy attacked and occupied Abyssinia. After the conquest of Abyssinia, the Pope expressed his joy in his speech of May 12, 1936, by stating the triumphant joy of an entire great and good people over a peace which it is hoped and intended will be an effective contribution and prelude to the true peace in Europe and the world. Catholic countries' representatives at the League of Nations were directed not to vote against fascist Italy. The Italian Papal Legate, Cardinal Gaspari, the bishops of San Miniato, Nocera, Umlara, Civita Castellana, Milan, and Naples blessed the fascist Italian invasion of Ethiopia. The Archbishop of Toronto declared the war against Ethiopia should be considered as a holy war, a crusade, because the Italian victory would open Ethiopia, a country of infidels and schismatics, to the expansion of the Catholic faith. Many bishops and priests led the offering by giving to the fascists the jewelry and gold belonging to their churches. Fascist armies were immediately followed by priests, missionaries, nuns, and Catholic organizations. It is surprising that the Archbishop of Toronto alleged Ethiopians to be infidels and schismatics. T.L. Gardini, Colonel Schuster of Milan stated the Italian fascist flag is at the moment bringing in triumph the cross of Christ in Ethiopia to free the road for the emancipation of the slaves, opening it at the same time to our missionary and propaganda. Teeling, practically without exception, the whole world condemned Mussolini, all except the Pope. Slavambini, Italian cardinals, 7 Italian cardinals, 29 archbishops, and 61 bishops gave immediate support to the aggression against Ethiopia. In his address to archbishops, bishops, and priests, Mussolini admired the efficient cooperation given by the clergy during the war against the Abyssinians, remembering with particular sympathy the example of patriotism shown by the Italian bishops who brought their gold to the local office of the fascist party. Manchester Guardian, February 12, 1929, Pope Pius XI is credited with much admiration for Mussolini. That the Italian clergy as a whole are pro-fascist is easy to understand, seeing that fascism is anti-nationalist, authoritarian, anti-liberal, and anti-socialist force. The Jesuit scholar Martindale, representing the Pope, confirmed that the Secretary of the State of the Vatican, Eugenio Cardinal Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII, offered Haile Selassie 1 million sterling on behalf of Italy in return for his abdication. Spacci continued to state Bishop Andre Marie Elie Gerasau, Haile Selassie's former tutor and a man who had influence over him, also invited the exiled ruler to recognize Italian sovereignty over Ethiopia. By submitting to Italy, he could rule with Italian consent. So even the Italian and Catholic tutors that Haile Selassie had, that his father had instructed him to have, wanted to convince His Majesty to surrender. Earlier today, the Pontiff, Pope Pius XI, had given his recognition of Italian sovereignty over Ethiopia by bestowing his apostolic benediction upon Victor Emmanuel as King of Italy and Emperor of Ethiopia, statement by an eyewitness. From my book, you can note how one of the Catholic priests took the personal responsibility to entice me to be a priest, how we, the seminarians, marched outside Harar in a heavily Muslim country protected by fascist military to attend church every week. This was a clear policy of the Catholic Church in support of fascism. The establishment of Collegio Ethiopico within the Vatican compound was to train and indoctrinate Ethiopian seminarians. We were then told that if we become good potential priests, we will be eligible to go to Rome for further education and indoctrination. There was a definite crusade to propagate Catholicism in Ethiopia with the help of fascism based on apartheid policy I had faced on my way to priesthood. Contrary to the abundance of evidence proving Pope Pius XI's complicity with Mussolini and the fascists, Zade Reta claims that the Pope, in his speech to graduating nurses, expressed as an aside to his formal speech a statement to the effect that he objected to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. However, in addition to the evidence provided above, Reverend Dr. Mikre Selassie quotes Gaetano Salvemini in his book. To anyone reading without close attention, Pope Pius XI's address to the nurses gives an impression of condemning not only the war, but also this particular war as an abominable crime. In actual fact, it does not condemn the imminent war. It condones it as a war of self-defense. In addition, it puts in a plea for indulgence and leniency should Mussolini in the exercise of his rights of self-defense exceed the limits of moderation. In his book, Church and Mission in Ethiopia during the Italian occupation, the Pope very clearly expressed his love and wholehearted support for Italy and the fascist government. These are proofs that some Vatican cardinals and clergy rallied behind fascism, among them the Cardinal of Milan, Alfredo Ildefonso Schuster. In addition to his anti-Ethiopian campaign, the Cardinal was photographed with war generals and others next to tanks, machine guns, and the army, which were on their way to invade Ethiopia. Even Catholic papers flatly admitted that Pius XI had permitted colonial war. The conscience of the world condemned Italy's vigorous approach. Gert Boucher also wrote in 1938, what did the papacy do? The church demanded that the bishops hand in their gold crosses and chains. Yes, the Pope even gave the Duce Mussolini the frozen assets in Germany so that Italy could purchase the necessary raw materials. The Vatican, Pope Pius XI, played a central role in both making the fascist regime possible and in keeping it in power. The central player in the effort to keep Pope Pius XI in check was Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli, later Pope Pius XII. By mid-September 1935, Eugenio Pacelli, Cardinal Secretary of the State, and later Pius XII, sent word to Mussolini that Pope Pius XI would not stand in the way of an invasion of Ethiopia. As Professor Christopher Dugan noted in Fascist Voices, the Church provided overwhelming backing for the war, with 7 cardinals, 29 archbishops, and 75 bishops offering public endorsements to the press. From the preponderance of the evidence provided above, there should be no doubt whatsoever that Pope Pius XI and the fascist Mussolini were in league in the fascist aggression, including the invasion and the war crimes in Ethiopia. Therefore, the campaign for a formal and public Vatican apology, as well as the restitution of property such as 500 documents presently in its custody to the Ethiopian people, is fully justified. Italy has long been a supporter of the victims of Nazism and fascism. Thus, this incredible insult to the memory of over 1 million Ethiopian victims of genocide is incomprehensible. Even more appalling is the lack of official action and condemnation of the Graziani Memorial. We therefore demand, in the name of justice and respect for human rights and humanity, that the Italian government dismantle this outrageous memorial and adjoining park immediately. Rodolfo Graziani directed a 3-day massacre of the 30,000 unarmed civilians in the capital of Ethiopia upon the orders of Benito Mussolini. Over 440 Christian monks were singled out and murdered. People were dismembered, and soldiers took photos of the hangings, beheadings, and torture proudly alongside their dead victims. The Graziani massacre is well known to every Ethiopian and virtually disgracefully unknown to the rest of the world. Graziani, prior to arriving in Ethiopia, was named the Butcher of Libya. I think he was called the hyena of Libya. In Libya, Graziani presided over concentration camps, used chemical weapons, and murdered thousands of innocents for fascism. Unfortunately, it is also a historic fact that the representatives of the Catholic Church supported, participated in, and even encouraged these brazen acts of genocide against Orthodox Christian Ethiopians who were somehow viewed under the dogma of the time as less civilized and not deserving of respect as fellow Christians. Today we fight on for international recognition of the Ethiopian genocide restitution and against the resurgence of fascist ideology. Some of our ongoing projects include recognition that 1 million Ethiopians were among the first victims of fascist genocide, reparations by Italy for the huge loss incurred by Ethiopia, including survivors and their heirs. Italy has never paid a penny in restitution to the victims of genocide, return of looted cultural property, including priceless manuscripts from Italy and the Vatican Library, dismantlement of Graziani Park, a memorial which glorifies the war criminal Rodolfo Graziani, who directed a 3-day massacre of over 30,000 unarmed civilians in the capital of Ethiopia upon the orders of Benito Mussolini. Apologies to the people of Ethiopia from the Pope and the President of Italy. All the above projects are underway and included demonstrations, legal claims, petitions, education, research, and other activities. The Global Alliance is a non-profit entity based in the United States. It is entirely self-supporting and exists only through the direct services of its volunteers and donations. Eugenio Mario Giuseppe Giovanni Pacelli was papal nuncio in Munich between 1917 and 1930, Cardinal Secretary of State between 1930 and 1939, and Pope Pius XII thereafter until his death in 1958. Pius explicitly invoked ex cathedra papal infallibility with the dogma of the Assumption of Mary in his 1950 Apostolic Constitution. Pacelli was a great friend of Germany. He gave the young, destitute Adolf Hitler a large cache of church money to aid the rising revolutionary and his small, struggling band, thereby financing the emergent Nazi Party. Before the Papal Enclave of 1939, in which Pacelli was a candidate, he told Diego von Bergen, German ambassador to the Holy See, of his preference for conciliation towards Nazi Germany. Ensuring a favorable outcome, the German cardinals decided to vote for Pacelli. He never excommunicated Hitler. He never placed Hitler's Mein Kampf on the index of forbidden books, and he never directly criticized the Nazis. After the war, he actively intervened in favor of some Einsatzgruppen and death camp commanders. Pius became the main instigator of the Cold War, and on several occasions he actually urged war, even advocating an atomic preventive war. In the fateful year 1939, Cardinal Pacelli was elected Pope Pius XII. As a reward, Cardinal Hinsley says, for his 10 years' superb fight for peace, he had allied with the Vatican with Germany, Italy, and Japan, helped Franco to seize Spain, and delivered the peoples of South America to the tender mercies of fascist colonels and generals of the Peron type. His moral authority was mortgaged. On the very day of his coronation, March 12, Mussolini drove 69,000 Jews beggared and suffering from Italy, but the Pope was too busy to notice the outrage. His church, it is said, saved many Jews, yes, rich converted Jews. The policy of the heads of the Roman Church is stamped in red letters on the history of Europe. Unfortunately, no branch of public instruction in school, press, or literature in our time is so lamentably distorted by suppressions and untruths as our references to the part that the Church has played in European history. The candor of the fine historians of the last century has disappeared with them. We now get histories of Europe which completely falsify the role of the Church, and our more important historians are silent. Does it matter if we leave the dead past to molder on its grave? It does vitally when the claims which are made for the value of the Church today are based mainly upon the apologist version of history. It matters still more for our present point of view, because now that people know nothing about the Church's crimes against humanity in the past, they are less inclined than ever to consider critically its actions in our modern world.
Tesfaye Gassese was also fortunate to have the emperor take notice of him. He was training to be a lawyer when Haile Selassie caught him performing.
I was nervous when he came, but still I guess I was good enough to convince him it was a good performance. Called me in the morning to his palace, gave me his watch, asked me what my plans were. I said, I'm going to go and study law. He said, I asked the minister beside him, how many students are going to study law? I think he answered 12. 12? Oh, that's quite a lot. So we have very many lawyers under training. We need someone in the theater. I said, they're the administrators of the theater, the managers and directors, were white people. They didn't speak Amharic, the local language, and so he needs Ethiopians to replace them. So he said it was a sort of an order, you go and study theater. I graciously accepted it, and I don't regret it at all. I'm very happy with the profession. And well, I'm a racer.
He ended up as the manager of the National Theatre, as well as starring in countless performances. His favorite was Hamlet.
I played Hamlet also for the Emperor. That's another great play. I was the first Hamlet. I had were what we call first Ethiopian premieres by our prominent, later on prominent playwrights, were staged by me.
Haile Selassie stayed interested in Ethiopian theatre throughout his life.
See, after him, that's what we missed. There were no leaders on, to see our productions, but he did attend comedies or historical plays or tragedies. He did, and even before the Italian invasion and the establishment of proper theatres in the country, he used to invite people who wrote dialogues or pieces of theatre to his palace for when his children got married, or from wedding parties and things like that. And he gave prizes to the writers and to the actors. So he was a great benefactor of the arts, a patron of the theatre and the arts.
Despite his pressing duties as head of state, his personal touch was always felt.
The general populace worshipped him, and so you can imagine him coming here and we small actors being honored by his presence. He usually also stayed late after the show and shook hands with us and said, "Good," and left.